On her first day at the mansion, the new maid freezes when she sees photos of her daughter's father everywhere. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10 at the end. Enjoy the story. Some moments arrive without warning, carrying the weight of destiny. For Hannah Fowler, that moment came on a crisp autumn morning in Chicago when she walked through the iron gates of the Harrington estate for the first time. She had no idea she was walking straight into the past she thought she had buried forever. Hannah had spent 5 years building a life from scraps. 5 years of double shifts, of whispering promises to her daughter Mila that someday things would be better. When she saw the job posting for a live-in housekeeper at the Harrington mansion, she applied without hesitation. She needed this. Mila needed this. Evelyn Harrington answered the door, elegant and refined, her silver hair swept into a chignon. She interviewed Hannah with gentle questions, listening as Hannah explained her situation with careful honesty. Single mother, 4-year-old daughter, hard worker who just needed a chance. Something in Hannah's directness touched Evelyn. She offered Hannah the position immediately, along with a third-floor suite where she and Mila could live. Hannah felt tears prick her eyes. This was the break she had been praying for. During the house tour, they moved through elegant rooms filled with antique furniture and crystal. Then they entered the main living room, and Hannah's entire world tilted on its axis. Her eyes fixed on the mahogany sideboard where silver and crystal frames displayed family photographs. And in every single one, the same face smiled back at her. The same crooked smile, the same deep-set eyes, the same dimple in his left cheek, the same face Mila saw every time she looked in the mirror. Hannah's legs went weak. Her mind reeled backward through 5 years to Santa Monica, where she had been 22, working at a beachside cafe. He had walked in one afternoon, backpack over his shoulder, introducing himself as Ethan. 2 perfect months followed, filled with laughter and beach walks and the feeling of being truly seen for the first time in her life.
Then, one morning, he was gone. No note, no goodbye, no explanation. Hannah tried to find him, but he had vanished like smoke. Weeks later, she discovered she was pregnant. The years that followed were brutal. She had Mila alone, worked herself to exhaustion, moved from city to city, chasing better opportunities, survived on 3 hours of sleep and hope. She never tried to find Ethan again. He had made his choice clear. But now, standing in this mansion, staring at these photographs, Hannah realized everything she thought she knew was a lie. Ethan wasn't Ethan. The man who had fathered her child was someone else entirely. Someone who belonged to the Harrington family. Hannah's hand trembled as she pointed at the largest photograph. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Madam, why is the father of my daughter in the portrait of your mansion?" Evelyn's face drained of all color. Her hand flew to her throat in shock. She asked Hannah to repeat what she had said, as if hoping she had misheard. Hannah pointed again at the photograph, her voice stronger now, filling with 5 years of questions and anger. "That man is the father of my child. He told me his name was Ethan. He left me 5 years ago, and I have been raising our daughter alone ever since. So please, tell me why he is in your family photographs." The silence was deafening. Evelyn gripped the edge of the sideboard, seeming to age 10 years in an instant. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with sorrow. "That man is not Ethan. That man is my son. That man is Alexander Harrington." Evelyn led Hannah to the study in silence, her shoulders set as if bracing for impact. She poured 2 glasses of brandy with shaking hands and stood by the window, gathering strength to begin. The story came out slowly. Alexander Harrington, her son, brilliant but crushed under expectations. The Harrington fortune stretched back 4 generations, and Alexander was the only heir, groomed from childhood to lead an empire. His father was a hard man who loved Alexander fiercely, but manifested it as relentless pressure. When Alexander was 26, his father died suddenly of a heart attack. The weight of the entire legacy crashed down on him. 3 months after the funeral, Alexander disappeared. He left a note saying he couldn't breathe, needed time to figure out who he was outside of being a Harrington. He promised to return when ready and begged her not to look for him. Evelyn respected his wishes, though it nearly destroyed her. She told the board he was taking leave for health reasons and waited. Months turned into years. He returned 8 months ago, Evelyn said, finally turning from the window. He came back different, quieter, more grounded. He stepped back into his role as CEO, reintegrated into society, even got engaged to a young woman from an appropriate family. Evelyn had been so relieved to have her son back that she didn't ask too many questions about his missing years. Now, looking at Hannah, Evelyn felt the full weight of what her silence had cost. She had a granddaughter she had never met. Hannah listened with strange numbness, then anger burned through. He had lied about everything, let her fall in love with a ghost. When he was done pretending, he simply erased her from his story. Hannah's voice shook as she told Evelyn everything. Meeting Alexander in Santa Monica, not knowing who he really was. The 2 months together, how he seemed to genuinely care. How he vanished, leaving her alone and pregnant. 5 years of being both mother and father to Mila. The words poured out like confession. 5 years of carrying this weight alone. When Hannah's voice broke, Evelyn crossed the room and pulled her into an embrace, crying too, quiet tears of guilt and instant grandmother's love. When the sobs subsided, Evelyn said Alexander would need to know about Mila, but the decision of when and how to tell him belonged to Hannah. Hannah felt grateful for that mercy. She wasn't ready to face him yet. Evelyn mentioned Alexander was returning from a New York business trip the following week, not expected until Friday evening. Hannah nodded, feeling hope stir. A few days to prepare seemed survivable. She had no way of knowing Alexander's flight would land early, that he would walk through the door in less than 24 hours. The next morning, Hannah was in the kitchen, attempting to figure out the coffee system, when she heard the front door open.
Heavy steps followed, a familiar voice calling for Evelyn. Hannah's entire body went ice cold. He wasn't supposed to be here until Friday, but there he was, home early, his presence filling the house like a storm. Hannah stood frozen, the urge to flee overwhelming. But running would mean giving up this job, this stability, this chance for Mila. So she stayed, heart hammering, waiting for the inevitable. He came through the kitchen doorway, still talking to his mother, then looked up and saw Hannah. The world stopped. All color drained from Alexander's face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like he had seen a ghost. Her name fell from his lips. Hannah. Just that, in a voice rough with emotion and disbelief. Hannah's voice came out cold and flat. "Hello, Alexander." His real name hit him like a physical blow. He staggered back, gripping the doorframe. Evelyn appeared behind him, torn between protecting her son and supporting Hannah. Alexander asked how she was here, why she was here. Hannah could hear the panic in his voice, wondering if she had tracked him down.
Evelyn explained she had hired Hannah as the housekeeper, that the meeting was pure coincidence. Alexander looked at his mother like she had lost her mind. He turned back to Hannah, 100 emotions crossing his face: shock, confusion, guilt, fear. He said her name again, softer, almost pleading, and moved toward her. Hannah held up a hand, stopping him. Her voice was steady as she spoke. He didn't get to act surprised. He had made choices. He had lied about who he was. He had left without explanation. He had moved on while she picked up the pieces. Alexander flinched but didn't deny it. He apologized, raw and honest, explaining about his father's death, the crushing pressure, needing to become someone else just to survive. Calling himself Ethan had been the only time in his life he had felt free. But freedom, he said with his voice breaking, had come at a price he never should have asked anyone else to pay. He had been selfish and cowardly, and he would give anything to go back and make different choices. Hannah listened, feeling anger war with sympathy. Part of her understood, but understanding didn't erase what happened. She took a deep breath and told him the truth that would change everything. "You have a daughter. Her name is Mila. She's 4 years old, and she has your smile." Alexander's face went through shock, layering over shock. He sank into the nearest chair, his whole body trembling. Evelyn moved to her son's side, one hand on his shoulder. She was a grandmother now. Alexander was a father. Nothing would ever be the same. Hannah pulled a photograph of Mila from her pocket. Alexander stared at his daughter's face for the first time and wept. The days that followed were tense. Alexander retreated to process the revelation. Hannah went through her job's motions while her mind spun with questions. Evelyn moved between them like a diplomat, pushing gently toward resolution. Alexander studied Mila's photographs with frightening intensity, asking questions in a voice rough with emotion. What did she like? Was she healthy? What was her favorite color? Hannah answered briefly, keeping distance because he had earned it. 3 days later, Hannah brought Mila to the mansion. The little girl bounced through their new suite with delight, claiming the bedroom with the window seat. Evelyn asked permission to meet her granddaughter. They arranged tea in the sunroom, casual and low pressure. Mila was initially shy, but Evelyn's gentle manner and collection of kaleidoscopes won her over. Mila's delighted laughter filled the room, and Evelyn's face transformed with pure joy. That evening, Hannah agreed to let Alexander meet his daughter. She explained it simply to Mila. There was a man who lived in the house who would like to say hello. Mila accepted this easily, more interested in whether he liked dinosaurs. They met in the library. Alexander stood by the window, looking terrified. When Mila skipped in, his breath caught audibly. Seeing his daughter in person, moving and breathing and real, overwhelmed him. The resemblance was unmistakable. Mila stared up at him curiously and said with 4-year-old honesty that he looked sad. Alexander laughed, half-sobbed, and nodded. He said he was a little sad, but very happy to meet her. He knelt to her eye level, hands shaking, and told her his name. She repeated it carefully.
He asked if she liked books, and she launched into a detailed explanation of her favorite story about a princess and a dragon who became friends. Hannah watched them, watched Alexander listen with absolute focus, and something in her chest cracked. He was trying so hard. Evelyn appeared with cookies and milk, and Mila transferred her attention to the treats. Alexander stood, eyes never leaving his daughter, and turned to Hannah with tears tracking down his face. He mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." Hannah nodded slightly, acknowledging they were in this together now. When Mila left after an hour, she announced that Alexander could read her a story sometime if he wanted. the highest honor a 4-year-old could bestow, and Alexander looked like he had been given the world. The fragile peace lasted 4 days before Valerie Stone's arrival shattered it. Hannah heard her sharp voice echoing through the foyer, demanding to know where Alexander was and why he had been avoiding her. Valerie stood in the marble foyer like a model posing, all sleek blonde hair and designer clothes, beautiful, confident, and very unhappy. Evelyn greeted her with polite coolness. Alexander emerged looking exhausted. Valerie demanded answers. She wanted to know what was going on now, establishing her position as the woman with rights to his time. Valerie's eyes landed on Hannah, trying to retreat. She called out in false sweetness, asking if the new help could bring coffee. The emphasis on help made the hierarchy clear. Evelyn interjected with ice in her voice that Hannah was valued, and if Valerie wanted coffee, she could make it herself. Valerie flushed with anger. Alexander tried to steer her toward private conversation, but Valerie announced she was tired of being shut out and deserved to know what was going on. So Alexander told her bluntly. He had discovered he had a daughter. The mother was here, in this house. Everything had changed. Valerie's expression cycled through shock, disbelief, and fury. She turned to stare at Hannah with understanding dawning. The accusations came fast and vicious. Hannah was a gold digger who had tracked Alexander down. This was obviously a scheme to trap him and access the Harrington fortune. She turned on Alexander, calling him an idiot. Didn't he understand what this would do to his reputation, to their planned merger between her father's company and Harrington Industries? There it was. Valerie wasn't hurt about the child. She was furious this threatened her plans for wealth and status. Hannah felt sick, hearing Mila discussed like a liability. Valerie threatened to go to the press, to destroy Alexander's reputation. Alexander's response was quiet, but absolute. The engagement was over. He wouldn't marry someone who spoke about his daughter with such contempt. Valerie went white, then crimson. She promised he would regret this, would pay for choosing a nobody housekeeper and her child over a woman of quality. Evelyn stepped forward with pure steel in her voice. If Valerie breathed a word to anyone, Evelyn would unleash every lawyer and resource at her disposal. The Harrington family had weathered scandals before. Valerie was entirely replaceable. Valerie grabbed her purse and stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the chandelier. Later, Alexander found Hannah on the staircase, shaking with delayed shock. He sat beside her and apologized for subjecting her to that cruelty. Hannah wanted to blame him, but the exhaustion in his voice stopped her. He had just ended his engagement, publicly choosing his unknown daughter. He promised Mila would never know what Valerie said, would never be exposed to that cruelty. They heard Mila's laugh ring out from upstairs, bright and innocent. The sound anchored them both. Something had changed. They were united now, allies in protecting Mila, even if they couldn't be anything else. 3 nights later, Hannah woke to Mila crying. Not the normal whimper of a bad dream, but something thinner, more distressed. Mila was burning up, her small face flush crimson, her body radiating heat like a furnace. The thermometer climbed higher than felt safe, 103, 104. Panic flooded through Hannah. She grabbed her phone, trying to decide between ambulance or driving herself, when Alexander burst through the door. He must have heard Mila crying through the walls. Alexander said they needed to get her to the hospital now. His car was faster than waiting for an ambulance. Hannah didn't argue, just let him take charge because her brain was too fogged with fear. He carried Mila down the stairs with gentleness that contrasted his obvious panic, speaking to her softly, promising she would be okay. The drive to Northwestern Memorial was both endless and instantaneous. Alexander drove with controlled urgency, while Hannah sat in back with Mila cradled against her chest. Alexander kept glancing at them in the rearview mirror, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He was terrified. This man who barely knew his daughter was absolutely terrified of losing her.
The emergency room was a blur of fluorescent lights and medical personnel asking questions. When they asked about the father, Alexander stepped forward and said he was right here. The staff took him at his word, and Hannah realized this was the first time he had publicly claimed Mila as his daughter. The next hours passed in anxiety, ice packs and medication, monitoring and tests, Mila drifting in and out of consciousness while Hannah held her hand. And through it all, Alexander paced like a caged animal, his fear palpable. Around 3 in the morning, Mila's fever finally broke. The medication kicked in, and her temperature dropped to safer levels. Hannah pressed her forehead to Mila's small hand and cried, silent tears of gratitude and delayed terror. Behind her, Alexander made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. When she looked up, he was leaning against the wall with his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. The careful control he had maintained shattered, and he was weeping with the force of someone who had stared into an abyss and barely pulled back. The doctor confirmed Mila was stable. They wanted to keep her for observation, but the worst appeared to be over. Alexander moved to the bedside and looked down at his sleeping daughter with an expression so raw it hurt to witness. He reached out and brushed a curl back from her forehead, his hand shaking. Then he turned to Hannah with tears still wet on his face.
He said he understood now why she was so angry at him. He had stolen 4 years of this from himself, 4 years of being terrified and protective and desperately in love with this little person. But more than that, he had left Hannah to carry that fear alone. He had abandoned her to the weight of single parenthood, to the terror of moments exactly like this one, with no one to share the burden. His voice broke completely, and he said he was sorry in a way that made clear he finally, truly understood the magnitude of what he had done. Hannah didn't absolve him, she couldn't, but she nodded slightly, acknowledging his understanding. They sat together while Mila slept, not speaking much, just sharing the vigil. And when Mila's little hand twitched and reached out in her sleep, both Hannah and Alexander moved to hold it, their fingers tangling together around hers. It was the first time they had touched without anger or distance between them. And in that moment, sitting in the fluorescent glow at 4 in the morning, something like a truce settled over them. They were Mila's parents. That truth superseded everything else. They were bound together by this fierce, terrifying, overwhelming love for a 4-year-old girl who owned both their hearts completely. When the sun rose over Chicago, Mila opened her eyes and smiled sleepily at both of them, and Hannah felt something like hope stir in her chest for the first time in 5 years. Mila recovered quickly, the way children do. Evelyn had asked Alexander to help organize his father's old papers in the study. Alexander invited Hannah to join him, seemingly unable to be far from Mila even though she was napping under Evelyn's watchful eye. The study was imposing, all dark wood and walls lined with legal volumes. Alexander stood in the doorway, clearly steeling himself to enter a space that carried complicated memories. He told Hannah about his father, about a man who had built an empire but never quite figured out how to be soft with his son, about expectations that felt like iron chains and praise that came only for perfection. They worked in silence for a while, sorting through files and documents. Alexander was moving a filing cabinet when he noticed something odd.
The cabinet shifted easily, revealing a gap that seemed intentional. He pressed on the wood paneling, and a section gave slightly. A hidden compartment, small and cunningly concealed. Inside was a single envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with wax. Alexander's name was written across the front in his father's handwriting. Alexander stared at it like it might bite him. His hand shook as he lifted it. Hannah offered to leave, but Alexander asked her to stay, said he wasn't sure he could face whatever was in this letter alone. The letter was several pages long. When he finished reading, he just sat there holding the pages, breathing unevenly.
Finally, he handed the letter to Hannah. The letter was extraordinary. Written in the months before his death, Alexander's father had laid bare truths he apparently could never speak aloud. He acknowledged he had been too hard on his son, had demanded perfection because he didn't know how else to express his faith in Alexander's abilities. But the most stunning revelation came in the middle pages. The elder Harrington had known Alexander was breaking under the pressure, had seen the light going out in his son's eyes, and he had made a decision that went against everything his own rigid upbringing had taught him. He gave Alexander permission to run, to leave, to disappear for as long as he needed. The letter explicitly stated that if Alexander was reading this, it meant his father had passed, and Alexander was feeling crushed by sudden responsibility. The elder Harrington wrote that he understood, that he was giving his blessing for Alexander to walk away, to find himself, to learn how to breathe. The letter ended with words the elder Harrington had apparently never been able to say in life, that he loved his son, that he was proud of him, that nothing Alexander did or didn't do would change that, and that he hoped, someday, Alexander would forgive him for being a better businessman than father. Hannah finished reading with tears in her eyes. The tragedy of it was overwhelming. This father and son who had loved each other but never quite knew how to bridge the gap. Alexander was crying too, silent tears tracking down his face. He said, voice rough and breaking, that he had run because he thought it was the ultimate failure, and all along his father had understood.
Had even approved. The guilt and shame that had colored every moment of his time away had been based on a misunderstanding. Hannah's heart ached for him. But she also felt complicated anger. Because yes, the elder Harrington had given his blessing for Alexander to leave, but he had said nothing about abandoning the people Alexander met along the way. She pointed this out gently. Alexander nodded, accepting the criticism, acknowledging that his father's permission to flee his responsibilities didn't extend to fleeing his responsibilities to her and Mila. But something about reading that letter seemed to lift a weight from Alexander's shoulders. He could see his father's love clearly now, could understand that strength sometimes looked like asking for help, or admitting you couldn't handle everything alone. By the time they emerged from the study, the sun was setting. They had missed lunch, lost track of time, but they had found something precious in that room. They had found understanding. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a recognition of each other's humanity, each other's pain and regret, and desperate wish to do better. That night, after Mila was in bed, the three of them sat in the kitchen over coffee, and Alexander told his mother about the letter. Evelyn cried, the quiet tears of a woman who had lost her husband too soon and was still discovering the depths of the man he had been. And Hannah, watching this family knit itself together through shared grief and newfound understanding, felt the first stirrings of belonging she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge. Alexander's determination to be a present father manifested in ways that were equal parts endearing and disastrous. He threw himself into parenting with intensity, armed with good intentions and absolutely no practical experience. It started with breakfast. Alexander announced he wanted to make pancakes for Mila. The kitchen descended into chaos. He couldn't find the measuring cups, used salt instead of sugar, somehow got batter on the ceiling. The pancakes were burnt outside and raw inside. Mila took one bite, wrinkled her nose, and politely asked for cereal instead. The devastation on Alexander's face was profound. Mila quickly added that maybe they could try again tomorrow, and she could help. Alexander brightened immediately.
He insisted on packing Mila's lunch for preschool, producing a lunchbox with an apple, cheese stick, and a submarine sandwich larger than Mila's head. No juice box, no napkin, no utensils for the yogurt. Hannah quietly repacked it but saved the photo. There was something touching about his earnest incompetence. The school pickup was its own adventure. Alexander arrived 15 minutes early, parked poorly, then panicked when he couldn't immediately spot Mila. Hannah watched him frantically search before Mila appeared from the bathroom, oblivious to the small heart attack she had given her father. Mila ran to him shouting, "Daddy!" a title she had started using tentatively, but now wielded casually. Alexander scooped her up and spun her around, checking her over like she had been gone for days. The bedtime routine became Alexander's favorite part of the day. The first night he tried, he chose a letter-bound tome of Greek mythology, far too advanced and violent for a 4-year-old. Mila declared it boring and demanded her usual princess story. Alexander looked so crestfallen that Mila patted his hand and explained, very seriously, that he needed to do different voices for different characters, and there should be more pictures. She proceeded to coach him through the entire process, treating him like an apprentice learning a sacred art. By the end of the week, Alexander had actually gotten quite good at the voices, and Mila declared him an acceptable storyteller. There were still spectacular failures. Alexander tried to do Mila's hair and created something that looked like a bird's nest. He bought clothes 3 sizes too big. He panicked over a small scratch, ready to rush to the hospital before Hannah produced a cartoon Band-Aid. But he was trying. God, he was trying so hard. And Mila, with the generous heart of childhood, forgave every fumble and celebrated every small victory. The transformation in Alexander was visible. The tense, withdrawn man had slowly given way to someone softer, more open. He smiled more, laughed more, seemed to take genuine joy in the simple chaos of life with a 4-year-old. Evelyn commented on it one evening. She told Hannah she hadn't seen Alexander this happy in years, maybe ever. Fatherhood had given him a purpose and joy that business success never had.
Hannah could see it too, could see the way Alexander lit up when Mila ran to greet him, the way he listened to her endless chatter with complete attention. It stirred something complicated in Hannah's chest, pride and relief that Mila was getting the engaged parent she deserved, but also something else, something that felt dangerously like affection. She reminded herself of the hurt he had caused, of the years of abandonment. She couldn't let herself forget just because he was sweet with Mila. But it was getting harder to hold on to the anger when he looked at her across the dinner table with tired eyes and asked if he was doing okay, if he was being a good father, if Mila seemed happy. The vulnerability in those questions undid something in Hannah's carefully constructed walls. This wasn't the careless young man who had left her. This was someone who had learned about consequences, who was willing to fail repeatedly in pursuit of being better. One evening, after a chaotic day involving failed cookie baking and Mila somehow getting chocolate everywhere, Alexander collapsed on the kitchen floor and announced that parenthood was the hardest thing he had ever done. Mila, covered in chocolate, climbed into his lap and patted his cheek. She told him very seriously that he was doing a good job, that Mommy said trying your best was what mattered. Alexander hugged her so tightly, Hannah thought he might never let go. And when he looked up at Hannah over their daughter's head, his eyes were wet with tears. "Thank you," he mouthed silently, "for giving me this, for giving me her." Hannah felt her throat tighten. She just nodded, acknowledging the gratitude, accepting the olive branch. Watching him with Mila, seeing the love and dedication and desperate desire to get it right, Hannah felt something shift. The past couldn't be changed. The hurt couldn't be undone. But maybe they could build something new from the pieces. Maybe they could become a family, in whatever unconventional form that might take. The calm couldn't last forever.
The storm broke on a Tuesday morning when Hannah's phone began buzzing with calls from unknown numbers. When her friend Jessica called, asking if she had seen the news, Hannah's stomach dropped. The story was everywhere. Some tabloid, presumably fed information by Valerie, had published an exposé about Alexander Harrington's secret love child. The headlines were sensationalized and cruel, painting Hannah as a scheming gold digger. There were photos of Alexander leaving Mila's school, of Hannah and Mila entering the mansion. Their privacy had been invaded in the most brutal way, and the narrative was poisonous. Hannah felt sick reading the articles. They speculated about blackmail. They dug into her past and spun her struggles as evidence of gold digging. And Mila. They had published Mila's name, dragged a 4-year-old minor into public scrutiny without consent. Hannah was shaking with rage and fear when Alexander found her. He had clearly seen the stories. Evelyn appeared moments later, already on the phone with lawyers. Alexander was pacing like a caged animal, apologizing, promising to fix it, to protect them. Hannah wanted to rage at him, but she was too scared, too focused on protecting Mila. Alexander made a decision. He called a press conference for that afternoon. If the media wanted a story, he would give them one on his terms. Evelyn supported the plan immediately. Hannah was hesitant, but Alexander was adamant. He wasn't going to hide Mila like she was something shameful. She was his daughter, and he was proud to be her father. Hannah and Evelyn watched the press conference from the mansion. Alexander looked exhausted and determined as he took the podium. His statement was brief but powerful. He confirmed he had a 4-year-old daughter named Mila. He explained he had met her mother 5 years ago during a difficult period when he was living under an assumed name. He took full responsibility, acknowledging his mistakes. But he made it clear, with steel in his voice, that anyone who attacked Hannah or Mila would answer to him personally. His daughter deserved privacy and protection. Her mother was a remarkable woman who had raised Mila alone with strength and grace.
He looked directly into the camera. He said he loved his daughter, was grateful for the second chance, and the Harrington family fully embraced Mila. He would use every legal and financial resource to protect his daughter's well-being. Smear campaigns would be met with lawsuits. It was a declaration of war, polite but unmistakable, and it was effective. Within hours, the narrative began to shift. Some outlets remained vicious, but others started running more sympathetic pieces. The lawyers sent cease and desist letters. Evelyn made calls, applying quiet pressure. By the time they picked up Mila from school, the first wave had passed. There would still be gossip, but the legal threats and Alexander's public statement had taken the teeth out of the worst attacks. That evening, Alexander came to check on them. He looked wrung out, but determined. He apologized again. Hannah told him, with more honesty than she had managed in weeks, that she was grateful for how he had handled it. That standing up for Mila publicly, claiming her proudly instead of trying to hide her, meant more than he probably understood. Alexander said that being Mila's father was the most important thing he would ever do, that nothing mattered more than making sure his daughter knew she was loved and wanted and valued. Hannah believed him. For the first time since discovering his real identity, she believed completely that he meant it. She told him that Mila was lucky to have him, and the look of gratitude on his face was almost painful to witness. He reached for Hannah's hand, tentative, and when she didn't pull away, he squeezed it gently. They stood in the doorway of Mila's room, watching their daughter sleep, connected by shared purpose and slowly healing wounds. They had weathered the storm together. They had protected Mila together. And in doing so, they had become something stronger. They had become a team, a family, and maybe, just maybe, they could be something more. The weeks following the media storm brought unexpected peace. Life at the Harrington mansion settled into something that resembled normal.
Mila was thriving. She had adjusted with the resilience of childhood, making friends at school and basking in attention from her grandmother and father. She laughed more freely, carried herself with new confidence. She had stopped asking if they would have to move again. She had a home now, a real one, and she knew it. Alexander had become a real presence in their daily routine, no longer the awkward stranger, but a fixture in Mila's life. He still made mistakes, but had learned to laugh at himself and ask for help. Mila adored him with the uncomplicated love of a child who had never known rejection. Hannah watched their relationship deepen with feelings she was still learning to name. Pride in Alexander for showing up, relief that her daughter had the father she deserved, and something else, something warmer and more complicated. She had started to forgive him, not all at once, but slowly, in small moments. Each time he put Mila first, each time he proved through action that he was committed to being better. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was still being written, and Hannah was beginning to believe it could be a good one. Alexander seemed to sense the shift, the way her walls were slowly coming down. He was careful not to push, respecting boundaries, but she could feel him hoping. One evening in early spring, 3 months after that shocking reunion, Alexander asked Hannah if she would have dinner with him. Not in the mansion, not with Mila or Evelyn as buffers, just the two of them. Hannah's first instinct was to refuse. It felt dangerous. But then she looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the careless young man who had left her, but someone who had been broken and learned to rebuild himself into someone stronger. She said yes. Alexander chose a small Italian restaurant, intimate and unpretentious. They sat across from each other, and for a moment the silence was awkward. Then Alexander laughed and admitted he had no idea how to do this. Hannah smiled despite herself, acknowledging this was probably the strangest first date in history.
Alexander countered that technically this was their second first date, so maybe this was a chance to start over and do it right. The conversation flowed more easily after that. They talked about Mila, of course, but also about themselves. Hannah told him about the struggle, but also about the fierce joy of motherhood, about discovering strength she didn't know she possessed. Alexander talked about his return to Chicago, about therapy and learning to manage anxiety and slowly rebuilding relationships. He was honest about the work it took. He apologized again, most meaningfully, for all the pain he had caused. Hannah could see in his face that he truly understood the weight of what he had done. She told him something she had been thinking for weeks, that she was angry at the man he had been, but she respected the man he was becoming, that she could see him trying, see him growing. Alexander's eyes filled with tears. He reached across the table for her hand. This time, Hannah didn't pull away. She let him hold it, feeling the warmth of his palm against hers. He told her that he had never stopped thinking about her, that even when engaged to Valerie, part of him had been waiting to find his way back to the girl from the beachside cafe who had made him feel like a real person. Hannah's breath caught. She admitted that she had tried so hard to hate him, but she never quite managed it. There had always been a part of her that remembered the kindness in his eyes, the gentle way he had held her. They talked until the restaurant started closing. The conversation wandered from heavy topics to lighter ones, rediscovering shared humor and interests. When they finally left, the night air was cool and fresh. Alexander walked Hannah to the car, and at the door, he paused. He asked if he could kiss her. Not assuming, but asking permission with a vulnerability that made Hannah's heart ache. She considered saying no, protecting herself from the risk, but then she thought about the man he had proven himself to be, the father who read bedtime stories and made terrible pancakes and loved their daughter with his whole heart, the person who had stood up and claimed Mila proudly, the man trying so hard to be better. She said yes. The kiss was soft and tentative, nothing like the passionate encounters from 5 years ago. It felt like a promise instead of a demand, like a question waiting for an answer. Hannah let herself lean into it, let herself feel the warmth and rightness of being held by him again. When they pulled apart, both of them were crying, overwhelmed by everything that had led to this moment. Alexander rested his forehead against hers and whispered that he loved her, that he had loved her 5 years ago, even if he had been too broken to understand it. That he loved her now for the incredible mother she was, for the strength she possessed, for giving him a second chance he didn't deserve. Hannah didn't say it back, not yet. The words were forming in her heart, but she needed more time to be sure, needed to know this was real and lasting. But she kissed him again, and that felt like its own kind of answer. They drove back to the mansion in comfortable silence, hands linked. When they arrived, Evelyn took one look at their faces and smiled with quiet satisfaction. Hannah checked on Mila, finding her daughter sprawled across her bed, and felt her heart overflow with love and gratitude. They had come so far, the three of them, from that shocking moment in the foyer to this fragile new beginning. Alexander appeared in the doorway, watching his daughter sleep with an expression of wonder that never seemed to fade. Hannah moved to stand beside him. He asked Hannah if she would give him a real chance, not just as Mila's father, but as someone who wanted to build a life with her, someone who wanted to wake up next to her, to partner with her in raising their daughter, to love her the way she deserved. Hannah looked at him for a long moment, seeing all of him, the mistakes and the growth, the weakness and the strength, the man he had been and the man he was becoming. She told him that she couldn't promise it would be easy, that there would be hard conversations and moments when old hurts resurfaced, that she needed him to be patient while she learned to trust him completely. But yes, she would give him a chance. She would let them try to build something new.
Alexander pulled her into her arms and held her like she was precious and fragile and everything he had ever wanted. And for the first time in 5 years, Hannah let herself believe that maybe happy endings were possible after all. Not the fairy tale kind where everything was perfect, but the real kind, built on forgiveness and growth, and the choice to keep trying even when it was hard. The kind where two broken people found their way back to each other and discovered they were stronger together. Mila stirred in her sleep, reaching out instinctively, and both Hannah and Alexander moved to tuck her blanket around her, their hands meeting over their daughter's small form. She settled immediately, secure in the presence of both her parents, and smiled in her sleep. Outside the window, dawn was beginning to break over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. A new day, a new beginning, a future full of possibility and hope. Hannah leaned into Alexander's embrace and let herself imagine what that future might hold. Family dinners and bedtime stories, Mila's first day of kindergarten with both parents there, holidays and traditions, and the ordinary magic of daily life together. It wouldn't be perfect. There would be challenges and setbacks, but they had weathered the worst already. They had found their way through betrayal and heartbreak to something stronger. They had found family. They had found forgiveness. And maybe, just maybe, they had found love. In the doorway of their daughter's room, with the sunrise painting the world new, Hannah and Alexander stood together and faced the future with hope. The portrait in the mansion foyer that had started everything would always be there, a reminder of where they had been, but it no longer defined them. They were writing their own story now, creating their own portrait of what a family could be. And it was beautiful.